Hello, fight fans. Welcome back to WhatCulture Combat. And really quickly, we're gonna establish what's going on right now. We're going to assess this situation. I'm currently sat in my room with a bob hat on, with headphones on, looking like an absolute nutter. What is going on, Adrian? Where are you?
So I am currently at my father's tattoo studio. It's a makeshift office. I don't have good internet at home, so this is my lockdown MMA discussing avenue. This is what I've got.
Well, it's one of those things that I thought I had a quite eccentric place of work, but you've blown me out the water, Adrian. I want to be in the tattoo studio right now. But you might be wondering why we're here, what we're doing right now. We thought it'd be a good idea. Obviously, we've got a fight that could be or maybe could not be happening in Khabib Nurmagomedov taking on Tony Ferguson. And right there, you've got two fighters in terms of UFC history. You've got two of the most dominant fighters, not just in the lightweight division, probably in all of UFC ever. Probably in all of MMA in terms of streaks and everything else. So we thought it'd be a good idea, didn't we, Adrian, to talk about who we think are the most dominant champions in UFC history. So this goes across all divisions. We're going to take a lot of things into account. We're going to take records into account. We're going to take the caliber of opponent that they beat as well. And we're going to mention a few people that we believe probably make the cut for maybe the top four, and then a few people who probably just made the cut. Are we excited, Adrian? Are we ready to talk about these fighters?
Sounds good. I've got some hot takes for this as well, I think.
We're setting ourselves up for some backlash. It's good. So would you like to take the floor for your first fighter, Adrian? Let's get into it.
So my number one pick for not only the greatest UFC champion of all time, but the greatest MMA fighter that's ever lived is Georges St-Pierre. For me, no one comes close to GSP's dominance. From when he first won the title all the way into his last fight with Michael Bisping, you're seeing a guy who cleared out the division in multiple generations of fighters. You look at the welterweight division, the first guys he beat the Frank Triggs, the BJ Penns and the Matt Hugheses of the world. And yet by the time he was sort of on his way out of the UFC, guys like Johnny Hendricks and Carlos Condit, who represented the next sort of evolution of the division. So in terms of longevity, GSP deserves a shout. And then to come back against Michael Bisping, to become a double champion, and to join that elite group.
I've got to say that broke my heart, that fight. I've got some very hard feelings towards that night because I'm from Manchester. I'm born and raised in Manchester, and that was my guy. He took my guy down. He had what was it, like 4 years? Sorry, he had about 4 years off, and then just came back and took my guy's title. So he broke my heart there, mate. But carry on.
Especially when you hear about the stuff sort of surrounding that fight. When he talked about on Joe Rogan's podcast, he was saying about how the weight gain had sort of adversely affected him. Because for most guys, you think that, well, they're cutting weight. If they can remove that weight cut, it's actually going to benefit them. But GSP sort of talks about how healthily putting on mass was a real problem to fight a guy like, because Bisping's, we have this sort of strange perception of the size of fighters, because you look at when you see a guy like Michael Bisping, you say, oh, that's a middleweight. And a middleweight doesn't seem that big, but if you saw a guy like Michael Bisping in the street, you'd be thinking, God, that's huge,
It's a big
so
dude.
For GSP to go up to fight a guy of Bisping's stature, after already cementing his legacy, if GSP had retired after Johnny Hendricks' fight, he'd still be the greatest fighter of all time for me. But to come back and lay it all on the line in pursuit of even further glory, that's what's going to define the guys that we're going to talk about today. These are guys who have taken risks and have fought guys that they might not have needed to fight, but have cemented their legacy by beating guys who had legacies of their own. A guy like Michael Bisping is the greatest British MMA fighter of all time, without question. So for GSP to come back and face Bisping at arguably the peak of his powers and win is something really commendable, I think.
Definitely, and if you're looking at GSP in terms of fight streaks as well, just in terms of numbers, really, the amount of fights he managed to win without getting beaten was 13. He managed 13 fights, and that streak is still technically active. Just going to put it out there. He could technically come back. You never know. He might even jump in for Khabib Nurmagomedov, and we might have Tony versus GSP. You never know. But yeah, to be honest, I can't really argue many of those points. I think GSP should definitely be in this conversation for one of the most dominant fighters, champions in UFC history. So I'm going to go into mine now. My first selection. I'm going to talk about Amanda Nunes, who I think at this point it's very tough to argue with the fact that she is the most dominant female fighter in UFC history, in MMA history. You just look at the names. Just look at the names this woman's beaten. She's knocked off the likes of Valentina Shevchenko, Miesha Tate, Ronda Rousey, Shevchenko twice, Raquel Pennington, Chris Cyborg, Holly Holm, literally anyone there's ever been who's posed some form of threat or just had any form of credibility in the UFC bantamweight or featherweight divisions, she's beaten. It's that simple. And the thing I love about Nunes is the fact that she's very similar in my mind to somebody like Jon Jones, somebody we're going to get into. Whereas she likes to challenge herself in a fight. She's not a fighter who has a certain skill set, things that she likes to do, and just does them every time to win a fight, which she could quite reasonably do. She could probably just go out there with most people and knock them out in 10 seconds flat. But a lot of times she tends to see who she's up against, see what their strengths are, and she tries to beat them at their own game. It's frightening. Yep. She did the same against Miesha Tate. She choked out Miesha Tate, who was a submission specialist. She obliterated Ronda Rousey, who was this knockout artist, arm breaker. And she did the same with Chris Cyborg and all these people. And Holly Holm, she beat with a head kick. Holly Holm's the head kicker. Yep. It's just it's stuff like that where there's not many fighters in my recollection that have been able to do that, been able to pick and choose how they want to win a fight, what they want to showcase, what they want to give off when they get in the octagon. And that's a sign in my eyes of that's a next level, different caliber of athlete. What do you reckon?
Truly elite fighters. I completely agree. What Amanda Nunes has done is she cemented a legacy by beating the biggest names. Because if you look at someone like Ronda Rousey, who probably is deserving of some kind of mention in this discussion, Rousey sort of trailblazed. But the issue with Rousey is because by being the first female UFC champion, she couldn't beat a former UFC champion. As long as she kept winning, the only champion was going to be her. So her win streak retroactively doesn't look as strong as a girl like as Nunes does, because Nunes has gone and beaten, like you say, Holly Holmes, almost any woman. In fact, every woman above 115 pounds who's ever made a mark in the UFC has been beaten by Amanda Nunes. That is a fright. The only UFC female champion in the UFC, other than the 115 pound division, other than Nico Montano, the rest of them have all lost to Amanda Nunes. She's beaten every single champion other than Nico Montano at 125, at 135, and at 145 in the UFC. That is a legacy. I don't think any men's fighter could compare to that.
No, and that's it. So for me, she's got to be in the conversation. But now, open the platform yet again, my friend. Who is your next pick?
So my next pick has got to be Anderson Silva. So you look at a guy like, from the years of when he first debuted in the UFC in 2006 until that shock loss to Chris Weidman in 2013, Anderson Silva was just the man. He was the personification of the Matrix. He really made it seem like rarely have you ever seen a fighter display such a gulf in skill against the top contenders.
It was like he was operating on a different frequency, wasn't he?
Yeah.
It was frightening.
And that's the craziest thing. When you're beating the best guys, the guys who can do that to other... the contenders are beating people by some distance, and yet he's making these guys really solid guys. I mean, even you look at a guy like Chael Sonnen, who is my favorite fighter of all time. Chael gave him a great fight in that first fight, but in the second fight, Anderson, he lost the first round, but in the second round, he had an answer for Chael's offense. And I think that's a real quality that is going to sort of bring these fighters together that we're talking about today. These are guys that can adapt for the fighter that they're facing. Because people started to realize that Anderson was susceptible to being pressured. Guys were so scared of engaging him on the feet that Chael had a lot of success by just bulldozing through him and not showing him the respect that he'd sort of came to deserve. But Anderson still figured him out. And that's something that a real champion-like quality is, to be able to sort of be beaten in a lot of aspects, but then to find a way to win. And that first fight with Chael Sonnen at UFC 117, that is one of the greatest performances in UFC history, maybe the greatest comeback in UFC history, to be beaten up decisively for 23 minutes and then to pull a triangle choke out of nowhere against a guy who would later go on to fail his post-fight drug test and who was fighting at the peak. That was the best Chael Sonnen ever looked in an MMA fight. And yet it still wasn't enough, because Anderson Silva had that will, that resolve to not give in. Even though he'd been beaten so decisively for such a long time, he could come out with these performances that he just didn't expect. And I can't think that many of us expected that, Chael Sonnen to be the second Chael Sonnen fight, to be the last time that Silva would defend his middleweight title. But even then, it's years of dominance. You look at guys now who build up a decent legacy, and they have a couple years. They'll do what a guy like Tyron Woodley had a great time as welterweight champion. But you compare the length of his reign compared to the length of Anderson Silva's. I saw a stat the other day that only 2 or 3 days ago, from when this video was being recorded, that is the amount of time since, in the time that Anderson Silva won to lost the title, I think it's 2,400 days. And it's been that long since Anderson. Now it feels like forever since Anderson Silva lost the title. So it's been the same amount of time from when Anderson won to lost the title than it is from when he lost the title to now. That's incredible. Yeah.
And that's the only sad thing about Silva is the fact that things did, when he eventually did lose the title, the wheels did fall off a little bit. But it's one of those things, if anything, it just showed how insane that record was, because he'd managed to beat the best of the best for so long consistently. Losing the 6 or 7, well, he had no contest, but 6 or 7 fights out of the next 8 after that, it just showed what level he was competing at.
Especially to say that he was getting up in the age, like he was an older man by the time that he was fighting Weidman the second time. To even get back in the cage after that leg break is just such a commendable thing. Like, he didn't need to do that. His legacy was cemented. I'm sure financially he'd been looked after in his time fighting. So to be able to come back and still continue to compete, he got a win over Derek Brunson, who was a perennial contender. As an older man, you know, this guy, I feel like often in the debate of some of the greatest of all time, we put too much importance on the later career. Almost very few fighters walk away from this sport unscathed. Unless a fighter can walk away at the peak of the powers, they're always going to have to take a few losses on their way out. But that shouldn't affect. A lot of newer fans might not realize just how good Silva was because of how his record looks. It's the same thing with BJ Penn. You look at these guys who are fantastic fighters, and yet it's almost like their legacy is tarnished by the last few fights. But I'm a big believer in that it shouldn't be, and that we should try and assess as best as we can how these fighters operated at the peak of the powers. And when it comes to Anderson Silva, few are quite as good as him.
It's the same as well with the likes of Robbie Lawler, people like that, people who just, towards the end, it happens, age catches everyone.
Yep.
But one fighter who you probably could say he's getting to that point of his career now where he's starting to become that veteran, but he's still showing no signs of slowing down, in the octagon, that is Jon Jones. That's my next and final real top 4 shortlist person we're going to talk about. In terms of Jones, you're just looking at the caliber and the level of fighter that he was taking down throughout his entire run as a fighter in the UFC. And the thing that's terrifying about Jones is the fact that he seems to have done it now across nearly 3 generations, which is obscene. The fact that he's taken down, he started off taking on the likes of Brandon Vera, took on the likes of Ryan Bader, and then he moved up to Quinton Rampage Jacksons, Lyoto Makita, Rashad Evans, Vita Bet. Like, literally, the list goes on. It is that terrifying. And then you get into that point now where, in the modern era, he's beating everyone in that light heavyweight division that's come up against him now. People who, at any other time, had Jones not been at the top of the mountain, would realistically be champions and be good champions at that. He likes the Thiago Santos, who nearly destroyed his own body trying to beat Jones. Dominic Reyes recently, his last fight, that he had a coming of age. And I think it's got to that point now where you see fights, you see people who fight against Jon, and it's this idea of, if you can survive, if you can get to 5 rounds with Jon, that makes you a star.
Yeah.
Which, again, it just shows you what he is. There's not a lot of the time you go into a fight with Jon, you don't expect him to lose. You just expect, if I can put in a good showing, I'm going to come out of this looking like gold at the end of it. It's frightening. But it's one of those things as well with Jon, the fact that he's, again, a fighter that's able to adapt to whatever's in front of him. He can pick and choose, where he did it in his younger career, like in the earlier days. He seemed to be able to choose how he wanted to win a fight, and he was one of the most out there strikers, like flying, spinning elbows, kicks, and the rest of it. Whereas now he's evolved, and this is something as well that needs to come into account when we talk about these fighters. It's the fighters that have evolved with the times, and as Jones has become the veteran, become the benchmark, let's say, in the light heavyweight division, he's started to develop. Well, he's always had it, but he started to wait out now until that 4th, that 5th round, those championship rounds, and that's when he seems to come into his own. He lets these young fighters who are coming in hot-headed and think, I'm gonna knock out Jon Jones. He can manage a fight, and that's what I was trying to get at. He's probably the best fight manager in UFC right now. The guy can manage 5 rounds better than anybody else in that company, and it's just that, and I think that in itself, it makes him. He might not be the most spectacular fighter now in his, I nearly said older age, but in his mid-30s. But he's definitely the most dominant. It's a frightening time right now. We've got Nunes and Jones both still operating at the peak of their powers. GSP could probably come back tomorrow and still do that, to be fair. But we've still got 3 of our 4 that are still up there and still doing everything they're doing. But what I want to ask you, Adrian, is if you think Jones's reputation as one of the most dominant fighters in UFC and MMA history has been ever so slightly tarnished by the stuff that we all know, like all the stuff that's been happening outside of the octagon. He's just been arrested, obviously, recently again. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's really difficult to decide how much significance to put into these kind of things, because it's something that it's a common criticism you see of guys like Anderson Silva. When Anderson Silva popped for steroids, I think it was after the Nick Diaz fight, people started to say, well, that's very likely an indication that he was always on the steroids. I mean, officially the line, it came down to the Cialis. It's the same sort of excuse that Jon Jones used. But people tend to make the argument of, well, how much does that invalidate to invalidate their legacy? And now that argument is also made against Jon Jones. He has failed performance tests for performance-enhancing drugs, and you've got to kind of decide. But the difficult thing is with our sport is that for a long time, and even now, you'll hear a lot of fighters say it's kind of a wild west to try and take away from a guy's legacy by saying, oh, well, he's popped. Just about everyone at a certain time may have popped, especially with how the tests have evolved. So it's really difficult. In terms of his conduct outside the cage, a lot of the time it's reprehensible, but it's really hard to use that to take it away from him. In fact, in some respects, you can almost make the argument that, how good might Jon Jones have been if he hadn't engaged in all this craziness outside of the cage? Because, when he talks about the Alexander Gustafsson fight, the first one, such a great fight, one of the best fights of all time. And yet he says himself, he did that after a weekend of partying. He didn't train to the fullest extent because he had this sort of godlike confidence where he just felt like he could go in there and beat anyone. And he still does do that. So it's a really difficult thing to sort of judge. So when we play, it does come into this argument of conduct outside of the cage. Because you look at a guy like GSP, you're going to struggle to get a less controversial guy than GSP. In terms of his legacy, he's never really been involved in something outside of the cage. In fact, one of the reasons he left the UFC following his Johnny Hendricks fight is because he believed that the drug testing in the sport wasn't stringent enough. And yet you'll still get a lot of people saying that one of the reasons GSP was so dominant is because people accused him of taking performance-enhancing drugs without any evidence. But it's such a difficult thing in our sport because there's always that sort of lingering possibility that these guys may or may not have taken performance-enhancing drugs, and to what extent that's affected their performance. So it just makes it so hard to really factor it into the discussion, because we'll never know, the true extent of performance-enhancing drugs. All we can do is see who pops on tests and say, well, that means, this. But then does that taint a fighter's entire career? If Anderson Silva does fail a drug test against Nate Diaz, does that mean, it's wins against Vitor Belfort, his wins against Chael Sonnen? Are they invalidated? I don't think so personally, but it definitely muddies the waters a little bit.
Definitely. And I completely agree. And so they've been our four top shortlisted fighters. You might not agree with them, which again, there's been a lot of fighters in the UFC. All right, there's been a lot of dominant champions. So let us guys know in the comment section below. Let us know what is who are your picks, who you think falls into that bracket. Obviously, we've missed a couple. We've missed the likes of Jose Aldo, Max Holloway, Demetrius Johnson, all these people. We could sit here for hours. We honestly could sit here for hours talking about these guys and gals. And Ronda, we've made a bit of an argument for as well. People like this who all had stellar careers and stellar runs as champion, but only 4 could make our list. So let us know who you think makes yours. I have been Gareth from WhatCulture Combat. You can find me on Twitter at gmorgan04. Where can they find you, Adrian?
They can find me at AD Bishop on Twitter.
Lovely. And hopefully we'll see you guys very, very soon. Please make sure you're staying safe. If you are in isolation, if you're still working, we tip our hats to you. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you very, very soon.